in a broad sense, and human rights as part of that, and to just introduce some of the major philosophical themes of social ethics and how they relate to the work that you are doing and going to be doing, and the challenge of sustainable development. I believe that if we don't have a moral framework around this, or an ethical framework, not only is sustainable development impossible, but organized society is impossible. And perhaps one of the big threats that we see in the United States right now is the lack of shared ethics, very different views about social values, major differences of underpinnings of views, and I think that this is a danger to the society. And from a practical and empirical point of view, one of the reasons why so much of our economic and social and political life in the United States is at stress right now. So my view is that these ethical questions are extremely important for our own thinking and understanding, for the kinds of judgments that we would take on key issues, and are extremely important for effective social organization, how societies form values for cooperation, and how political systems can work effectively to raise well-being, and how forms of global cooperation can be can take hold. And human rights plays an important role in that, because human rights is part of global law, and it's an attempt. It's fragile in many ways, and it's powerful in other ways, but it's an attempt to find some universal shared bases for ethical behavior and for the ethics that can underpin government. So that's the topic that I want to take. It's a big theme. It's a lifetime theme, and unfortunately I'm only going to be able to touch on the surface of many of these ideas, but we can have discussion afterwards, and also plan to continue to discuss these ideas in all of the classes ahead. So the first question is, what are ethics, and especially I'll call it social ethics, though in some dictionaries that would be redundant, and what's the relationship of social ethics and development? Ethics is the study and analysis of how people should behave, and how they should behave vis-a-vis other people on an interpersonal basis, and how broader social institutions, and probably most importantly government, should operate. Now, should is a big and loaded question. It means that there is a desirable underpinning, and the whole question of ethics is a question of normative issues, meaning the identification of what is good for people and what is good for society. We distinguish between normative issues and positive issues. Positive issues meaning what is, not what should be, but what is. And social ethics is largely a field of normative study. It's trying to find the bases for social behavior that in one way or another can lead to a desirable should outcome. Of course, you can also study ethics as a positive field, to ask what are people's ethical views, what are the shared values, what are the disputed values, so it can be viewed purely in positive empirical terms. But today I want to talk about ethics mainly in normative terms. Are there rules for behavior that are the rules that should be in place? And on what basis would we say should? Do we say that it's the Ten Commandments are those appropriate rules? Should people not kill each other? Should rich people help poor people? are there ethical principles that can be defined to answer questions like that? Or is it all that there is no such thing as should? You can only observe what people actually do, and there is no basis for guiding underlying principles, which is a view that at least some people feel, and some philosophers have staked out, though I think most of us feel that there is such thing as an ethical basis of behavior individually, and an ethical base for government, and an ethical base for global cooperation, though what we feel about it might not actually be shared by others. And so we have to understand whether there is not only our own view that there is something of a should, but also that we share the ideas of what that should be. So we'll look at two different issues, the interpersonal issues. What do I owe you from one person to another? Do I owe you honesty? Do I owe you some measure of trust? If you're in trouble, do I have a responsibility to come to your aid? Do I have a right to ask something of you? Do you have the right to expect me not to somehow harm you? And are those beyond just the practicalities of law, but somehow basic ethical ideas? When it comes to government, obviously we have some very, very major issues, and in a way it's remarkable how the basic issues are being debated right now in the US, though not in a very organized way, mainly in a screaming match, which is how a lot of politics gets done. But there's definitely a strong view that says, by some people, I owe nothing to anybody, and I certainly owe nothing to a government that claims to want to do something for somebody else or some other groups. Leave me alone. That's my right. And there are others who say, no, what should be done is to help people who don't have health care to get health care, or to help people who are poor. What are the issues, and what are the kinds of philosophical bases that can underpin this? There are, I think, three broad streams of thinking about this. I'm not a professional ethicist, and so I may be wrong. But as a practicing development economist for 30 years, I've tended to feel quite strongly that there are three kinds of ways that the should gets defined in our world, and that provides the basis for people's beliefs about the should. One of those is definitely religion, because many, many religions, though perhaps not, well, I think all religions have an important should component to them on certain dimensions. The nature of that should differs by religion. Some religions, I would say especially the monotheistic religions, tend to say the should comes from God's commands. And so if you want to know where the moral basis of society is, look to the specific commands that have come from God, as found in the scriptures, in the Bible or the Quran, for example. And for a lot of humanity, that is well and good the basis of the should that we're talking about. Even though when you go to the sacred texts, it could be pretty hard often to figure out exactly what the should is, because there's lots of different ways to interpret the should, and often contradictory ways over the course of different books, stories, and so on. But for a great part of humanity, religion is the essence. And in opinion surveys in the United States, people are asked regularly, can a non-religious person be a moral person? And most Americans think the answer is no. That religion comes from, morals come from religion, and an atheist or an agnostic couldn't be a moral person, because there'd be no basis for that morality. That's an empirical observation I'm making, that's the view of a majority of Americans in opinion surveys. This is obviously by itself already quite a challenge, because there are lots of people in American society who aren't religious and who feel themselves moral, but clearly there's a base of disagreement within the population. There's a second very deep strain of reasoning about social ethics, which is that ethics arise from the social condition of humanity. In other words, they're not coming from God's commandments, but they're coming from the existential reality of human beings living in society. And the basic idea there is that because human beings are intrinsically in need of social life for survival and for well-being, there need to be effective rules for how individuals interact with each other. And then the science of social ethics over the centuries has tried to identify what kinds of working rules can lead to reasonable outcomes in a way. So this is a pretty pragmatic kind of social ethics. It says you derive the should in a way from the is. In other words, you try to identify how it is that we exist, survive, what human biological needs are, what human psychological needs are, what the challenges in a society are. And the idea of social ethics is to identify generalizable principles. So, thou shalt not kill is, in this view, is not because it's a commandment of God, but rather because it's a pretty reasonable social principle that, if it is very widely abused, would make social order impossible. And of course, all of these rules are abused and violated, so the questions are not 100% compliance with any should, but actually the broad acceptance and operational nature of these principles. And in this second philosophical approach, which is very much part of the Western tradition and very much part especially of the English and American tradition, the rules come from an idea of individuals creating a society through some kind of contract, the social contract. And so the idea is, as the lawyers sit down to negotiate the should, what should the lawyers decide from the point of view of making an effective contract of individuals? Most other parts of the world don't see things exactly this way, as society being a contract among individuals. But in most parts of the world, there is a social philosophy that isn't necessarily religiously or theologically based, but is pragmatic. And so there are long traditions, say Confucianism, which is a set of doctrines of good social behavior, which underpins a lot of East Asian thinking about morality and ethics and government behavior. It's not a matter of commands, it's a matter of ideas of what would constitute a right order of society, in other words, rules to live by. Then there is a third dimension of the should, which also has a very deep strain in thinking, which I view as somewhat different from the second. The second is a little bit of legality and game theory, if I could put it that way. And the third goes more to the core of the nature of each of us as individuals and asks, what kind of behavior comports with our human nature in a way that can lead to a good life. And this is asked in the Western tradition very clearly by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. And in that remarkable study, Aristotle, through several chapters, says what leads to the good life. And his answer is that a moderation between various kinds of extremes lead to the good life. Don't be too hedonistic, but don't be too ascetic. Don't be reckless in one's bravery, but don't be timid. And it's a book about balance, of finding a moderate path. And the idea is that if people live and strive for virtuous behavior, which is largely behavior that tries to avoid the extremes, the temptations on the one hand and the asceticism on the other hand, that this leads to happiness ultimately, and that it comports deeply with human nature. And ethics socially derives from that basic idea, that the society's good is a society that promotes virtuous behavior of its citizens. So this is very different, in my understanding, from contractual ideas. It says that society should be organized in a way to make us good people. And to make us good people means to make us behave in a virtuous way. And by being virtuous, we also end up happy, not in the sensory stimulation, euphoric sense, but in the long-term sense of fulfillment and well-being. In the Eastern tradition, I find a very great similarity of that kind of view with Buddhist thinking. Because in Buddhist thinking, the same philosophy, first of all, of a middle path is extremely important. And remember that the Buddha, when he left the palace as Prince Siddhartha, and he went to find the source of suffering in the world, after having lived a life of high hedonism, tried extreme asceticism and lived for many years as an impoverished and nearly starving mendicant. And then he decided after many years he wasn't getting enlightenment that way either. And so he said that the truth is some middle path between the temptations of the world and the asceticism, and he set out a right way for living. And the essence of the right way for living in Buddhist thinking is the ephemeral nature of reality that we face as individuals and within the universe. And accepting that ephemeral nature, it means not grasping for ephemeral things, but looking for the deeper truths. And part of that is the deeper truths of the logic of our actions and their effects on others. And the assertion of Buddhism is that by recognizing those interdependencies of our actions, we also we can also find a path to reduce suffering, and that the key to that from a social ethics point of view is a commitment to compassion. So that if one wants to find a path to happiness, the path to happiness does not come in maximizing the utility function by maximizing income and then optimally distributing it such that the marginal utility divided by the price is equalized across n commodities, but rather it is by doing good works for other people, by being compassionate to all sentient beings, and thereby having a fulfilling life and escaping from the grasping of ephemeral temptations that can lead us into short-term stimulus at the cost of long-term suffering. So again, I view that as different from the second idea that we're looking for rules of behavior in a contractual way. And I view it as very different from economic hedonism, which says that we are individuals with our individual tastes. The higher is the income, the higher is the well-being. We have an indirect utility function, which defines our well-being over income and prices, and our goal is to get as high an income as possible, and we may make contracts with others, even social contracts, in order to achieve that. In Buddhism, obviously, it starts from completely different premises about human nature and about the sources of well-being, but it does lead to a kind of social ethic. And it's an ethic of responsibility, and it's an ethic of having higher happiness by giving rather than receiving, and having higher happiness by embracing interdependence rather than embracing one's individual freedom. So these are three quite distinct bases of social ethics. And we have a big world of 6.9 billion people who, in one way or another, usually not in a very learned way, most people have not studied social ethics. They've not necessarily thought very hard about social ethics either, still less about political ethics. But one way or another, through cultural processes, through school, through family, through own experience, people find at least important foundations for their beliefs on their religious upbringing and tradition, or on the thinking about the role of the individual in a society where Western thinking puts a great deal of emphasis on the individual as the sovereign, and then asks how individuals who are sovereign in utility or in freedom or in liberty can interact effectively with each other, or in the idea of individuals as reflecting a certain fundamental human nature and existential reality, not just a contractual reality. These are related to another basic kind of distinction that's made. They don't map exactly the same way, but sometimes social ethics are defined as having grounding in obligations, in consequentialism, or in virtue. So the obligations say that social ethics arise from duties that we have, but you could see how easily that can come from the religious tradition. The duties come from God's commands. Consequentialism says that responsibilities and ethics arise because rules have consequences. So you're led to cost-benefit analysis. What's a good rule? What's a bad rule? And then the third of virtue is, in my interpretation and understanding, the Aristotelian or the Buddhist idea that this arises from our core human reality. And it's not that we're so much interested in defending ourselves against others, so it's not really the problem of sovereignty and power, which has been the great struggle of Western philosophical thinking for 400 years. It's really the question of what leads to our own happiness. And by finding that, we also find a kind of social ethics. So duty, consequentialism, and virtue are another way to define this triad. If you turn to religion, fortunately, in many ways, major religions share some of the key tenets. Although religion typically has two aspects that are, or another aspect that is also often problematic, and that is an us versus them aspect. So religion often defines rules of behavior as God's commandments, especially the monotheistic religions, but it also often defines rules of behavior of the in-group that can be quite different from the rules of behavior vis-a-vis those from outside the same faith. So a lot of the commandments are commandments that are not totally generalized, but are really about how a religious community should exist in itself, and that can be different from how that shared community interacts with the rest of the community. If you look at the Jewish faith, for example, when one of the great Jewish sages, Hillel, who lived around the beginning of the first century, he was asked, what are the ethical teachings of Judaism? And I think he was actually asked to describe the ethical teachings of Judaism while standing on one foot. In other words, give the elevator speech equivalent of the first century AD. And his answer was, do not do unto others what you would not have them do to you. So that is the golden rule stated in its negative variant. There are two variants of the golden rule. Do unto others what you would have them do unto you, and do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. And Hillel stated that the essence of Judaism was the golden rule, and he added the phrase, all the rest is commentary. Now, in Jewish tradition, there are thousands of volumes of commentary. So it's notable to say that there's one sentence, one rule that can define things, but this is a rule of behavior of mutual, in a way, mutual respect as the core, and a sense of equality at the core in a certain operational way. There are other aspects of the Jewish faith that are, I think, notable, as well as all of the specific laws and commandments in the First Testament of the Bible. Two other major doctrines that are important are the supreme value of human life. And again, I emphasize that in all cases, high values are not necessarily lived in practice, but these are the values that are to underpin the ethics. And there is a doctrine that says that to save one life is to save the universe, which I find to be quite a beautiful doctrine. But it is an expression of the intrinsic, ultimate value of life as part of God's plan. And there is another doctrine which is called healing the world, tikkun olam in Hebrew, which says that there's a command upon each individual to help improve the world. That the world, the universe is torn morally. It's a wounded world, a wounded universe, and that it's the responsibility of each person to help heal the wound. So these are bases of social ethics. Another way that this was famously put, which I think is a wonderful expression, again by Hillel, who stood on one foot and described the golden rule. He also said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am not for others, what am I? And if not now, when? So the idea is a kind of balance between the individual of importance, the command for respect for others and compassion for others, and also the temporal urgency of doing the right thing. This isn't to start later, this is to start now. So that's a kind of traditional base. The Christian Gospels, and specifically the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, talks a lot about economics, and it talks mainly about responsibilities to the poor and the lack of importance of material goods for ultimate salvation. And so in one of the Gospels, Matthew, Jesus teaches that when the final judgment comes, those who have tended to the needs of the poor will be the ones who are saved. And they will ask on judgment, why am I being saved or why am I not being saved? And the answer will be, because those who fed the least among thee actually fed me, your Savior, and those who did not feed the least among thee and did not look after those in need neglected me. And so there won't be salvation. So these are ideas that the core is not only a command, but ultimately a new idea added in Christian faith, which is about salvation as an end point of behavior. Not all Christian faiths believe this, and with the Protestant Revolution, Reformation, I should say, there was a lot more move to what is called predestination, that ultimate salvation doesn't actually depend on individual behavior, but depends on God's will that's beyond individual determination. But in the Gospels, there's a lot about individual determination. And there's a famous translation, which is, by the way, disputed, trying to understand what the ancient Aramaic means, but a line that says that it's harder for a rich man to enter the gates of heaven than for a camel to pass through the head of a pin. In other words, don't expect to take it with you, and B, don't expect that you're even going to have room. There's going to be a reservation for you. And the point being that wealth is not the route to salvation. In a lot of social teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, there is and some very wonderful social ethical teaching, there's an emphasis that ultimately, while private property may be useful for social and economic organization, in the end, it's not really your property, says the social teaching. It's really God's property. So there's an ultimate destination of human possessions, and ultimately private property has to also serve basic needs, and especially what's called the preferential option for the poor, which means that you can't have a just society that neglects the poor. So in this way, there is a kind of a shared philosophy. I should have pointed out in Jewish faith also that kind of charitable impulse. In the Islamic faith, similarly, in the 5 pillars of Islam, one of the pillars is zakat, which is a commandment of charity. And that commandment is reflected in a numerical way of a contribution of a given proportion of wealth for use for services by the community for the poor. And there's also an ethical command in Islam that that the funds raised by zakat be properly used within the community. So there's ethical commandments on the political behavior of the community leaders who would use the zakat. So this is all to say one could look obviously very deeply and at many other religious traditions, but the idea of mutual reciprocity, respect for other individuals, compassion for the or help for the poor, I should say, and this in the name of God's creation is a common feature of social underpinnings of ethical commands. If we turn to that second broad classification of the contractual or the social basis for ethical behavior, this is a philosophical tradition that in modern times goes back to Hobbes, to John Locke, to the U.S. constitutionalism, to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then to many variants, to Bentham in utilitarianism, and to Immanuel Kant in the German Enlightenment, and up to our time in many different schools of thinking. But the basic idea in the Western philosophy starts out somewhat different. First, it's looking for a secular, non-religious basis for social ethics. It's not asking where do the commands come from, but what is the right organization of society. Secondly, and I think quite differently from a lot of non-Western thinking, society starts from the idea of individuals who then have to aggregate, whereas that's a pretty unlikely reading of the actual anthropology of our species, and an unlikely storytelling for how society actually forms, because individuals never get together to form a society. We are, as Aristotle said, a social animal to begin with, and our evolutionary base of Homo sapiens sapiens is living in clans. Now, what's true is that we've expanded the size of those clans, because the evidence is that on the savannah 50,000 years ago, when humanity was formed in its biological and its in its biology and evolutionary psychology, maybe the band was 100 people or 150 people, and maybe largely related. And now we have social aggregations that somehow have to embrace 6.9 billion people because of global interdependence, and countries that reach the scale of 1.3 billion people with multiple languages, religions, and all the rest. So there are big problems. And so this idea of contractual base is an interesting way to view things, probably not a historically right way to view things in a way, but on the other hand, it also has some merits when you think about the scale of, and diversity of the societies that we live in now. The core model for thinking about this is the prisoner's dilemma. It's the basic tool of game theory for the last 60 years. It's an ingenious idea, and at the core of it is, and at the core of Western contractual social ethics, which started with Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century in the Leviathan. You can almost say that Hobbes invented the prisoner's dilemma idea. So the idea of the prisoner's dilemma, of course, is a two-person game. And in that game, each individual has a choice whether to cooperate with the counterpart, or what we say is the opposite of cooperate is to defect. And this usually comes because the idea is that they're two prisoners, and either they can keep quiet, each not confess, in which case they're cooperating, or they can confess, which is quote-unquote defecting against their counterpart. And the idea is that if they both cooperate, they're better off than if they both defect. But if one person cooperates, the other person is better off defecting, kind of ratting out the other, or cheating on the other person, so that cooperation is difficult. It's not stable. It's not an equilibrium. Because if we all get together to cooperate, you know what, I'll let you guys cooperate, but I'm going to do something else and save my money, save my taxes, squeal on you, steal from you, or whatever, and that's a dominating strategy. So the basic idea, as I think all of you know, is to set up a matrix of this game. One person is in the rows, and the second person is in the column. And they each have to decide whether to cooperate or to cheat, and the payoff that they get as individuals is given by those numbers. And the first number is the person in the row, and the second number is the person in the column. So if both cooperate, the outcome for both is that they get a payoff of 1. If both cheat on each other, they get a payoff of -3. So you would say, well, surely cooperate. On the other hand, if the first person who is in the row cooperates and the second person cheats on them, the cooperator ends up with -5 and the cheater ends up with +5. And so the incentive, if I know you're going to cooperate and I'm just looking after my individual interest, I should cheat. If we both say we're going to pitch into something, and then you put your money on the table, I'll free ride, let you buy it. So the idea of this payoff is that even though if we both end up doing the cheating, we end up in a very bad way. It's even better for me to induce you to cooperate and then for me to cheat on you. And, excuse me, the non-cooperate or defect outcome, where both sides fail to cooperate, is the dominant or Nash equilibrium of this game. And it's easy to see. Suppose that the first person cooperates. What's the best strategy for the second person? To defect. Suppose that the first person defects. What's the best strategy for the second person? To defect. No matter what you do, my best strategy is to cheat. No matter what I do, your best strategy is to cheat. That means that the equilibrium of this game is that we both cheat. And what do we end up with? -3, -3. Ugh, that's terrible. We need to move that to cooperation. So how do we do that? What are the ways? There are several different answers to that question, but that's the essence of contractual social ethics. One is we get together and we make laws that prevent the cheating, because we recognize there's temptation and we stop that temptation. Hobbes, the first English political philosopher of modern times, in the Leviathan said, well, it's easy. We make a sovereign government which is all-powerful and prevents us from cheating. And he called that all-powerful government the Leviathan. And he said that's what should stop us from this terrible self-interested behavior. Because otherwise we'll have a war of all against all. Everybody will just be cheating. So that's one answer. Second answer is that we make rules, legal rules. If you cheat, you go to jail. Of course, the court system and the police also have to be honest to enforce that, because they may have an incentive to cheat as well, taking bribes and so on. So making a legal system to enforce good behavior raises the issue to another level, which is a major issue, of course, in development. A third possibility is we make a social norm, that if you cheat, you get banished from the community. You're despised, you're ridiculed. And so the costs of cheating really are much higher than you think. A fourth idea is that we create reputations. You can go on a website and get your credit rating. And if you've cheated a lot in the past, no one's going to play with you. So you try to maintain a reputation, and by having a reputation, what's called a repeated game. You don't cheat even though it's in your short-term interest, because in your long-term interest you want to maintain the reputation so that others will continue to cooperate with you. So it can be norms, it can be laws, it can be social contracts, it can be the power of the state which breaks through the prisoner's dilemma. And that is a major issue then for how society of individuals with self-interest can live together to reach cooperative outcomes. And there are big debates. It's probably the hottest, it's been the main topic of social theorizing for 30 or 40 years. Is cooperation possible? Where does it come from? What's the role of government? What's the role of private interest? Do we have the instinct to cooperate? And so on. If you give that prisoner's dilemma game to people and put them in a situation of the prisoner's dilemma game, the amount of cooperation is much higher than the game theory predicts. People tend to cooperate, except economics students. who actually look at the matrix and decide that they're going to cheat. That's an empirical reality, that economics students have cooperation trained out of them. It's sometimes called trained incapacity, and I think it is a real phenomenon. Most people have a tendency to cooperate, and where that comes from is a big debate. Some people, psychologists, feel that it may be hardwired as part of evolutionary psychology. The cheaters ended up getting eaten by the lions, and those that didn't cheat passed their genes on to others that ended up being cooperative. So that there may be a deep evolutionary dynamic that underpins our capacity to cooperate, and therefore the reality of cooperation, even when the game theory says that we should be not cooperating. Sometimes this is called the warm glow of cooperation. Sometimes it's said that we have neurons, mirror neurons, where I really feel your pain. Not necessarily in the Bill Clinton sense, but in the real physical, psychological sense, that it is, when I see you suffering, I feel it, I can't help it, because I'm hardwired that way. We have mirror neurons that take what I'm observing and directly translate that into my neurotransmitters and make me feel the same thing. So this individualistic idea of how we are psychologically constructed is actually wrong from a neuroscientific point of view. That's a very important idea that's being explored now. There is this idea of reciprocal altruism, which basically means that you want a reputation. I cooperate with you because I want you to cooperate with me in the future. It's a repeated game. There's the idea of kin selection, that we're more likely to cooperate within families because that passes along cooperative gene-based behavior more likely. And there's the idea that some people in society are just primed to punish non-cooperators. And this is an interesting idea, that people expend resources, they make themselves worse off to absolutely diss someone who has done something socially inappropriate to other people. And that those are like the enforcers. So you ask, well, how is it that the police and the judges do it? The argument about altruistic punishment is that some people are hardwired to act as the social police in the society, creating either reputational harm or some other cost to people who don't abide by the social rules. It doesn't do them any direct good. They're just hardwired to enforce the social norms. So that's another idea that is part of the game theory. As I said, aside from the evolutionary psychology, it could be attempt to maintain status in society through observing values, and it can be law or politics, as Hobbes and others have put it. Now, why is cooperation important? Because when you get to real economies, the individualistic model of purely private goods that are traded doesn't apply for most of the things we're studying. As we talked about last time, or talked about in earlier lectures, there are public goods like the health of the physical environment which require cooperative behavior. That can be cooperation through laws, through community participation, through the reputation, don't throw your garbage into the park. Whatever it is, whatever the ways to get cooperation, we depend on cooperative behavior, because market behavior, individualistic behavior, won't provide crucial public goods. That could be the defense of the nation. It could be the justice system. It could be building infrastructure, where each individual might block the road saying, that's my private property. But the society has to agree, no, you can't stand in the way of the road. We need that road, all of us together. And we have a law called eminent domain, or a principle of law, which says the government can take property with compensation in order to overcome the individualism that would otherwise block the common purpose. And we need cooperation in the case of pollution control to control externalities. We need it for climate change and other biodiversity conservation and so on. There's another aspect of the human condition that is important, and that is what's called distributive justice. So far I've talked about how to cooperate. I've mentioned from a religious point of view commands to help the poor. But now in a contractual way, when we think about society as a social contract, what do we say about the fact that some people are poor in a society of affluence? What do we say about the fact that some people are dying or starving in a world of riches? Is there a requirement as part of the social rules, the ethics, to do something about that? This is the big debate in America right now. Some people say very specifically, I don't care if they're poor people, stay out of my pocket. I don't owe them anything, still less are you going to tell me what I owe them. If I want to do something, I'll give charity on my own time, my own amount, it's my choice. You don't tell me at all what to do, and if the government tries to come, I vote it out of office. And so that's a very important American view, and not just in the United States, but it's a very strong view in the US. Others say, are you kidding? Society owes it to everybody to have health care. Society owes it to everybody to have enough to eat. That's part of everybody's right. That's part of the social ethical responsibility of government and so on. So these are the distributional ethics that we need to grapple with. It's not just about how to get cooperation, it's a question about taking from somebody to give to somebody else. Is that the right thing to do? Is it commanded? Is it part of social ethics? It's a crucial question for us in a world of great wealth and great poverty. And in the problems of sustainable development, it's a major issue because it's literally, empirically, positively in the sense of the is, that people are dying because they're too poor to stay alive. Does that trigger a should? That's not right. That's not part of the social ethic. There's responsibility to do something about it. Of course, there's a big debate about what the sources of inequality are, and I should have added a couple of other major ones. But birthright and inheritance, luck, health, genetic endowments, economic shocks, poverty traps, and effort, I would say. Individual effort is another major consideration. People have different views about which of these are most important. There is a libertarian of some influence right now in the United States, believes there should be no government redistribution of all. He's a very wealthy person who's been a lot in the news recently, David Koch, who is a major oil and gas industry owner. He's worth at least hundreds of billions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of wealth, and he's spending a lot of money to say that he shouldn't have to pay any taxes to help anybody, that's not anybody's business, his wealth. He told an interesting story when he's also a philanthropist to his causes, and he gave money to his prep school, several $1 million, and when he gave the money, he told a story. He said, you may ask how I came to be here today giving this generous donation. And he said, when I was young, my father gave me an apple, and told me if I don't consume the apple, but I sell the apple and I earn something, I can get 10 cents for it, and I can buy 2 apples. And if I sell those, I can get 4 apples, and if I sell those, I can get 8 apples. And so I did this week after week. And then he says, and then a little while afterwards, my father died, and I inherited $300 million. The point is an interesting point, and that is, it's an interesting story, but that's what he said in the speech. Here you have someone of inherited wealth, great wealth, whose moral and ethical claim is, I have no responsibility whatsoever other than what I personally decide to do. And so that's a position on distributive justice, which is called the libertarian position in the United States. And there are many other positions. Now, let me use this diagram, which is sometimes called the utility possibility frontier, to distinguish between two categories of problems that you'll grapple with all your careers. That line on the outside, or the curve, shows the possibilities for the well-being or the utility of two people. Person one is on the horizontal axis, person two is on the vertical axis. And by virtue of this downward sloping curve, it's possible to make person one better off compared to person two, presumably by taking a little of the wealth or income away from person two and giving it to person one so they have more goods. So going from point B to point C, the utility of person two has declined and the utility of person one has gone up. Continuing from point C to point D, it's the same. If society is at a point inside the utility possibility frontier, like A, point A, this is a point of inefficiency in the economy, meaning that it's possible to make both people or all people better off. For example, maybe by controlling pollution, or by building a road or building a bridge. In other words, some collective behavior perhaps can improve a market outcome and take you from point A to point C, or ending a monopoly. If you're inside the utility possibility frontier, life has a certain advantage, because you, as an economist or a development specialist, can say, I have a way to help everybody be better off. And to go from point A to point C is raising the utility of both individuals, or if we were doing such a graph for the whole society, of everybody in the society. If you're at point A, however, going to reform could take you not just to C, but it could take you to B, or it could take you to D. A free market economist might come along and say, we should liberalize the economy in some way. That will make things more efficient, and we'll go from point A to point B. You see, we're more efficient. What's wrong with that, though? What's wrong is that individual one is left worse off by this. Or going to point D, where individual two is left worse off by the reform. We say that reforms are Pareto improving if everybody is improved by the change. That would be a move from point A to point C. We say that reforms are efficiency producing if you go from inside the curve to outside the curve. That's not necessarily Pareto improving, however. We say that there is redistribution of well-being if you are on the frontier, going from a point like C either to B or to D. If you are at a point like B, person two has high utility, person one might be on the verge of starvation, very low utility. Then comes the redistributive justice question. Is there an obligation of society to move from point B to point C? That's the redistributive justice question. The logic of moving from A to C is rather straightforward. Everybody's better off. But what about the logic of moving from B to C? That is taxing Mr. Koch and taking some of the money and helping some very hungry people. That's moving from point B to point C. That same graph can apply not only to people within a given time period in the society, but across time. So we could think of the horizontal axis as the well-being of the current generation, and the vertical axis as being the well-being of future generations. And we could be inside the curve because we're doing something very inefficient, over-polluting and making both the current and the future generation worse off. Or we could be on the curve at a point like this one, in which the current generation is doing quite well in well-being, but the future generation is much worse off. That would be a case, for example, where we say, we've got a depleting resource and we're the ones alive right now, let's use it all. And whatever happens to the future generations, let them be damned, they'll figure out what to do on their own. But why should we hold back? We really like those fish. Yes, they're going extinct, but they're so tasty, you know? Oh no, we should conserve them. Why should we conserve them? We won't have them for Sunday breakfast anymore. They'll be too expensive. So that's a choice that's an intertemporal choice. And the question is a social ethics question as well. What is the responsibility of the current generation to the future? We're not very good at asking this question. At least when there are two of us, we can argue with each other. But when the other side hasn't even been born yet, it takes a lot of moral imagination to say, I need to think about that. You get that when you think about your parents and you, what they did for you, or as a parent, when you think about the well-being of your child. That's where our intertemporal moral capacity first arises. We think about it in our own lives. Then we extrapolate if we can develop the moral imagination to do so. But it does say we're in a chain of humanity. We're not going to meet most of the people who will ever live, but in a way we have a kind of stewardship for them right now, and that's what social ethics is also about. Social ethics by thinking about ourselves as individuals and what is our human nature. And there is a strong contrast between the ideas of Western individualism and the ideas of Aristotle and Buddha and others in that tradition, which say that our own human nature is not fundamentally as individuals, but fundamentally as part of a society. And therefore, our basic well-being cannot be defined by our own individual utility as if we don't care about the other. But rather, our own well-being depends intrinsically on how you're doing. And so the idea of a game between individuals is the wrong starting point, says the Buddha, or says Aristotle. The right starting point is to think about, try to find methods to think about the real human condition, and therefore to derive from the human condition and human nature ideas about social ethics. And interestingly, both Aristotle and Buddha, which I tend to view myself in a kind of Western-Eastern pair of similarities, used almost the same ideas in the end, the middle path, the middle way, moderation in all things. And they both talked about the fragility of human tastes. They would not be very impressed with the utility function. They would say, oh, that's just short-term, ephemeral stimulation. That has nothing to do with your happiness. Money is the source of happiness. Are you kidding? It's how you regard your life. And if you really want to be happy, give away that money. Help other people. Be engaged. Build a life. Very different idea from the consumption-based stable utility function that is an individualistic one. So these are, and in that view arises a different kind of social ethic, which starts from the idea that it's almost unthinkable, it's unimaginable to have hungry people. Because how could anybody be happy, even the well-fed people, if there are hungry people? All people will suffer if suffering people are allowed to continue to suffer. It's an empirically testable point also, because these are not religious-based doctrines, they're not theologically based doctrines. They are observations about human well-being and human nature. And they're really observations that if you're too individualistic, If you're too concerned about your own well-being, you'll end up unhappy. And there is a growing body of psychological evidence that this is correct, that the real sources of happiness are not based on the individual consumption of goods and services, but on the social connections of individuals. Though individual consumption matters a lot, especially at the low end of income. When you're hungry, it really matters. But beyond those basic needs, it tends to matter less and less, though status still does matter. And being relatively poor in a richer society can be a source of stress and anguish as well. So, coming to a long, still long conclusion, we have many different variants of social theory, and let me just mention them quickly, because this has been a long, overlong talk. First, in the West, and these are mainly in the Western tradition, I would say. First is utilitarianism, of which our utility-based economic theories tend to reside. And that is that individuals have relatively stable determinants of their own well-being, and that the job of social rules is to maximize that utility in some sense. The way that the founder of utilitarianism put it, Jeremy Bentham, is the greatest good for the greatest number. It raised 180 years of subsequent discussion. Well, what about the poorest? What about the people dying? What about some people killing one person to make themselves feel better off? Is that utilitarianism? So there's libraries filled with questions and caveats, but the basic idea is stable, individualistic-based well-being and the role of social ethics to maximize that. Then there is the contractual ideas. And the contractual ideas start in a similar way, and in fact these two variants can be combined. You have a bunch of individuals, and they get together and they choose some social rules. And Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher of the second half of the 18th century, created the idea of the categorical imperative. Anything of your individual behavior should be generalizable. The rules that are picked for society should give good operating principles for society. They should be logical and they lead to good outcomes. And he said good outcomes mean a well-ordered society. There should be taxation, it should build roads, it should help the poor, because a good society would have those rules. John Rawls, the late Harvard philosopher of the second half of the 20th century, was a Kantian philosopher who tried to update this in a kind of game theoretic way. He asked a question: suppose that all of us, before we knew our own identities in this society, were behind a veil of ignorance, and we're contracting for how society should run when we're going to be part of it. But we don't know which part of it. Maybe you're going to be up here teaching, I'm going to be down there listening. And so one rule should be the professor doesn't go on too long. So, in other words, we don't know exactly what role we're going to play, but we set the rules before we know. It's the ex ante. We don't know whether we're going to inherit good genes or bad genes, inherit $100 million or be part of a family deep in poverty and debt. So we want to set some rules. And what Rawls said is that people will be very risk averse. They don't want to end up at the bottom of the heap in desperation. So a good society, while protecting the civil and political liberties of people, will also maximize the conditions of the least well-off, the so-called Maximin principle. Other people who followed Rawls said, well, yeah, maybe not really. Who knows what they'll choose behind the veil of ignorance, but maybe they won't be so risk-averse. But taking that paradigm, you don't know what role you're going to play in society, but you're going to play some role, and you ask yourself, how would you like that society to be organized? Do you want it to be a society that doesn't let people starve? Well, I may be one of those. Yeah, sure. Do you want a society in which everybody has access to health care? Oh, absolutely. I don't want to find out that I'm one of the people without health insurance, and so on. So that's Rawls's idea for contractualism. Libertarianism, as I've mentioned, is the idea that what really counts is the sovereignty of the individual. You have a minimalist state which just protects security, enough to defend against invasion and enough to enforce your property rights. Other than that, stay away from me. I may be a great guy or a terrible person, I may be Scrooge, I may be hugely generous, but it's none of your damn business. I'll do what I want to do, when I want to do it, as long as I'm not hurting you. You have no say. You're starving, I'm rich? Well, I'll think about it, but don't come to tax me. This is a powerful variant of thinking. A lot of economists take this view. God help the profession. It is in my opinion, a very extreme view of human nature and social ethics. It lives on an edge of all that we've talked about. It declares that the supreme value is freedom of the individual. But we've talked about a lot of values. So my question about libertarianism is, why is liberty the only value that counts? Why isn't eating a value that counts? Why isn't compassion a value that counts? Why is liberty the only one? Well, one argument that was made is if you don't defend liberty, it will be so fragile that it will go away. And one of the leading libertarians of the second half of the 20th century, Friedrich Hayek, wrote a famous book in 1945 called The Road to Serfdom, which said if you meddle too much in the economy, you'll lose your freedom. You'll end up like a Soviet or Nazi totalitarian society. There will be a slippery slope from a little bit of redistribution or whatever, or a social welfare state, into the loss of freedom. That becomes not a philosophical proposition, but a testable proposition. Fortunately, it's wrong, at least as a general point, because many societies are highly redistributionist, but are very free and democratic societies. And three that are famous for this are Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. So-called social democracies, which tax a tremendous amount, which redistribute a tremendous amount, and which by all standards are highly free. Free press, free speech, democratic institutions, high quality of governance. And so that's a counterexample to the libertarian proposition. Then there's the basic needs idea. And the basic needs idea says that in social redistribution, what counts is not inequality per se, but the ability of the poor to meet their basic needs. Don't care about the rich, look to the poor. Can the poor meet their needs? If they can, that's crucial, but it's also enough. The idea is not envy of the rich, the idea is adequacy for the poor. I think there are a lot of compelling ideas in that. First, it puts primacy on those who need help the most, which is great. Second, it actually, even though it says the rich, once the needs of the poor are met, they're on their way, it also reflects a certain reality that the benefits of being rich aren't all that great. The real costs are if a society doesn't meet the needs of the poor, so that the psychological benefits of having more than you know what to do with just don't really add up to all that much anyway. So let them have it. Anyway, it's not usually put in this way. The basic needs is usually viewed as a highly redistributional philosophy of social ethics. But in fact, it's not so redistributionist. It is rather modestly redistributionist because it's concerned about the bottom. Then there is the capabilities theory of Amartya Sen, which says it's not just where you are on the utility curve, but how you get there. And what you need is the right to participate and to develop your own capacities. And so it is, as Amartya Sen has said, development as freedom. Freedom is key, Of course, everybody needs the right and has the right to be able to develop their capacity, so there's a basic needs aspect to it. But it's not just giving income or giving help, it's participation and building one's own capabilities that are fundamental. Finally, there's the human rights dimension. The human rights dimension says that people have rights as human beings that must be fulfilled. They're not God-given. If you're an atheist or agnostic, they're human-given in the sense that they come to you because you are a human being, not a member of a particular religion or creed or race or society. They're everybody's rights. These are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Mary Robinson will be talking about human rights in her lecture to the class. Finally, there is a list which I want you to look at of all of the ways that these social ethics issues apply. And we will be talking about these in the future lectures. Thanks very much.